So I do want to though welcome the three of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Very excited to have you participate. As the world's kind of changed, the Housing Action Coalition, along with our partners, have been doing a lot of these webinars. We were fortunate. I believe it was last week we were able to have the San Francisco delegation, Senator Weiner and Assemblymember Chu and Assemblymember Ting come and do a town hall with us, really focused on kind of housing. And so today we're really looking forward to hearing from the three of you. So I just want to welcome everyone in the audience. The Housing Action Coalition is really pleased to present this webinar along with our great partners, SPUR and California YIMBY. As we know, the affordability and displacement crisis is not contained to just any one municipality. It is truly a regional and state issue, and having amazing partners like SPUR and California YIMBY to kind of work with really makes it feel like that this issue, while daunting, is tackleable. And so we welcome both those members, those partners for helping us put on this event today. So as I said, I'm just going to do a quick introduction of Graciela, and I'm going to turn it over to her. And Graciela, I have to tell you, I was just kind of looking at your bio very quickly, and I was like, wow, incredibly impressive. And I could just tell everyone in the audience on like a personal note, as I've been going up to Sacramento a little more frequently over the last couple of years, Graciela has just been an amazing, just an expert on all of the process, the way the legislation, on policy, on legislation, and the politics, and has just been an amazing mentor for me to learn from. So I just wanted to say thank you. And as I was looking at your bio, I saw that you worked, I'm going to read a little bit here, but you were the Deputy Legislative Affairs to Legislative Affairs to Governor Jerry Brown. And during your time in the Brown administration, you negotiated directly, briefed and advised the governor on over 800 bills, and oversaw the regulatory implementation of legislation he chose to sign, including decriminalization of medical and adult use cannabis, streamlining of forestry, landscape management practices to prevent future wildfires, and reforms catalyzing development and construction of affordable and market rate housing. So Graciela has an intimate knowledge of the complex, powerful, but often opaque state budgetary process through years spent working directly with the California Department of Finance to shepherd passage of policy and fiscal changes through subcommittees, conference committees, and the full legislator. You also have a tremendous amount of work and expertise in housing and affordable housing. So thank you so much for agreeing to moderate this conversation. And I am looking forward to muting myself and listening to the three of you discuss these issues. So
Graciela, I bet you're very sad that you don't get to do this budget because it's so much fun.
I gotta say, thank you so much to both of you for making the time. I was just asking Jason about, was he excited that at least they may revise this out? Not excited about kind of the projections, but I know how much work it goes into kind of just rolling it out, making sure it's complete, briefing everybody. So thank you both. It's especially for willing to spend your Friday with us. I know it's been a long week. Really appreciate it. I know you have a lot on your plate, and even after this call, you're going to continue to work. So really appreciate it. Just for everybody out there to appreciate the people that we have with us today, we have Jason Elliott, who is the top advisor for Governor Newsom on all things housing and homelessness. And he is going to be the one shepherding a lot of the visions that Governor Newsom has, shepherding it through the legislative process and making sure that the vision is actually implemented. And he has actually many years of experience also at the local level. So this is great having somebody who understands what the local government is, the role of local government, some of the tools that they have, and then bringing that information and knowledge to Sacramento is amazing. And with us, we also have Kate Gordon, who's the director of California's Office Planning and Research, and she is tasked with all things that are climate change, land use, and she has decades working in that space and also in energy and economic development. And again, given where California is headed and the fact that we have the economic downturn that I think no one was envisioning at the beginning of this year, thank you so much for spending the time. I know that you guys have a lot of work in front of you, and we really want to make sure that you see us as a partner in trying to help in any way we can, just promote a lot of the goals that the governor has. So with that, maybe you guys can give us a little preview of what is to come in the next couple of months, and hopefully in the next couple of years, not only just with the economy as it is, but also just in housing. I know this has been a big priority for the governor, and would love to hear from you directly.
Thanks so much for that. Maybe I'll start, and then Kate, ask you to continue the discussion. So it's an interesting thing, right? We have this COVID pandemic. We have this $54 billion budget deficit. We have the catastrophic human toll of this virus. And amidst, perhaps despite all of that, I'm just reminded of the speech that the governor gave on February 19th, which feels like 100 years ago. That was the State of the State speech, in which he laid out a series of priorities and vision statements around housing and homelessness. And I can look back to that speech, and I can reread it now, and I can take a look at what we've just put out in the May Revise, and we can see that despite the human toll of this pandemic and the economic and the budgetary toll of this pandemic, our goals around housing and homelessness are relatively similar to what they were before the pandemic, with much greater urgency and much greater acuity. And in the case of the housing market, obviously there are different economic dynamics. So I don't mean to suggest that everything is as it was, but just as an example, previous to coronavirus, for February 19th, we gave an entire State of the State speech and we didn't say the word coronavirus. I mean, that just gives you a sense of how quickly the world changed. One of the centerpieces of that agenda around homelessness was acquiring hotels and motels to convert those assets into permanent supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness. That was something we announced on February 19th. Yet here we are on May 15th saying we want to now convert this thing called Project Roomkey, which maybe you're familiar with. We have over 15,000 hotel rooms now under control of the counties to house the homeless through COVID. Those are hotel rooms. We can now seek to convert those into permanent supportive housing. That's an example of a priority that we had worked for many, many months with many, many stakeholders to craft an approach, in this case, acquiring hotels and motels, converting them to permanent supportive housing. Then COVID happened, and we pursued the same strategy, but with much greater urgency. And we find ourselves in a moment, frankly, that I didn't think we were going to get to this quickly, but here we are now with 15,600 hotel rooms or some thereabouts under control of the counties, where we have relationships with these hotel owners, and we can start trying to buy some of these hotels. And that's one of the big initiatives now in the May revision. So that's on the homeless space. I'm way down a rabbit hole, but to come back up, the point is a lot of the things that we tried to work on and tried to brainstorm and try to start pushing towards before COVID are, in fact, we find ourselves with those same issues right in front of us now. And, in the housing space, because I know this is a conversation predominantly around housing and housing production. Again, I'll refer back to that State of the State speech in which the governor laid out three very clear objectives for what he wanted to see in terms of a housing agenda comprehensively, meaning what the legislature wants to accomplish, what we want to accomplish through our budget, and what we want to accomplish through our executive authority. Two pillars: more density in the right places, and then more certainty that once that densification and once that zoning occurs, that in fact it can get built. One without the other doesn't make as much of a difference as the two together. And then I guess the third is more accountability for cities to in fact do their responsibilities under the existing Housing Accountability Act, but also then to be more welcoming of that housing and make sure that it in fact does get built. So those remain our priorities: more densification, more focus on more housing, but also more certainty that gets built. Those remain our priorities. Now, obviously, with SB 50 not moving forward this year, and I know that a number of organizations on this call were sponsors of that piece of legislation, but not all hope is lost. And obviously, the Pro Tem has engaged a process to try to still get something very meaningful done on housing reform. We have every indication that she's going to continue, she being the Pro Tem, is going to continue to push forward with building that agenda. So we're very much in a support position, trying to, as you are, engage as a stakeholder with the Pro Tem's office and the Pro Tem herself to share our thoughts on what ought to be crafted coming out of SB 50, and including some other things we'd like to see in that bill. So that continues to move forward. In terms of what we control, we just put forward the May revision, which is our proposal for the state budget. That May revision includes the maintenance of $500 million in state tax credits for affordable housing. While it does revert some money to the general fund for other programs like the Infill Infrastructure Grant Program, it does in fact still maintain a number of key spending priorities, including what I hope Kate will talk about, which are GGRF investments in housing, and a lot of the money that we make available through Tia Boatman's operation at Cal HFA. So there's a deep commitment to housing and homelessness in this budget that really reflects a through line from sort of where we started last year, what we wanted to do in January, reflective of the pandemic, but not abandoning our values. And, you know, Graciela, you were asking me the question before we started this conversation of how does it feel to have the May revise out? And, you know, I think we worked really hard to try to maintain our values that a strong economic recovery is predicated on a strong housing sector. You can't have a meaningful and robust economic recovery if your housing sector is struggling. And we need to look back to 09, 10, and 11 to understand what a crumbling housing sector does to the economy writ large. So stabilizing the housing sector and then building forward from there. So the May revise, you know, we tried to invest in these priorities to the greatest extent possible, considering the fact that we're facing a 37% general fund deficit. I mean, there's no two ways to square that. You have to confront that head on. But I mean, I'll just tell you, there was an article that I think was in the Mercury News, I think today, and the headline was "Housing Advocates Breathe a Sigh of Relief." Right? I mean, so I think that's the answer to your question. How do I feel about the May revise being out? I mean, this was a difficult budget to go through, and we, Kate and I, work on things that are not just housing. This is one area of our portfolio, and so we feel the pain that exists for a number of social programs around the state, things that we both care very deeply about, seeing reductions and eliminations. We can go into some of those, including the postponement of CalAIM, which was not a housing thing. It's a healthcare reform piece that a lot of us were very attached to. And that's right now, as the governor mentioned yesterday, needing to be put, at least slowed down, if not put on pause. So, you know, this has been a painful budget process. To see that headline, however, I think does at least give me a little lift that those of you who are engaged in this work on a daily basis, and I'm just sort of looking through the participant list, and I see so many names of people that we're in touch with so frequently. And so this is a great group of leaders who are really dedicated to this issue. And to hear, and I know there are places to quibble and there are criticisms that are warranted about things that we've cut or reduced, but sort of taking a step back, the acknowledgement that the governor is still deeply committed to investments in housing and homelessness. Feels like, you know, you paint a picture and then you want to show people and you hope that they react the same way that you do. And I think in this space, you know, I was at least pleased isn't the right word, maybe relieved that this came across the way it did. Now, that's not to say that it was easy, and it's not to say that we did everything right, but we did the best we could based on some really difficult circumstances. And so let me just sort of stop there and ask my friend and colleague, Kate, to fill in her thoughts as well.
Thanks, Jason. That was very comprehensive. So I'll just add a couple of quick things. And one thing I think we're all really lucky to have is Jason in the role he's in, because he really does wake up thinking about these issues. And I don't know that he ever does sleep because he has a 5-month-old, but maybe sleeps occasionally and probably dreams about these issues. So, you know, my job at the Office of Planning and Research, we're tasked with doing long-range planning for the governor and for the cabinet. And as such, really are just by definition, take a very integrated approach to these issues. So we think about housing in the context of housing and transportation and land conservation and economic development. And sort of what does the state look like? What does the growth of the state look like going forward? And obviously the COVID has thrown a huge question mark into a lot of that. Many things have been affected by it that are in the space that we look at, not least of which is, of course, transit and transit operations, which are kind of integrally part of the affordable housing conversation. Also, just the whole telework question, to what extent is that doable for people? What will that look like for our land use patterns? So we're thinking about these things all the time. I will say that I'm really happy that we've continued to focus, despite, again, really difficult budget circumstances, on a couple of key priorities in that kind of integrated space. Looking at the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is where we fund a lot of this stuff, we've kept the structure of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund so that the continuous appropriations, the continuous programs, which really are the housing and transit programs, the Affordable Housing Sustainable Community Program, high-speed rail, the transit operations program, all of them are in, there still will be appropriated continuously. That's to remain May revision. On top of that, we've identified a set of core priority programs, which are, climate programs, but to me, climate is the thing at the intersection of all these issues. And those really focus in on, our most vulnerable communities in the state, and on making sure that as we're thinking about recovery, as we're thinking about near-term opportunity, we're not forgetting that we also are in a state that has significant and growing risks from current climate impacts like fire. So the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund priority programs really are in that space of, protecting air quality, protecting water quality, and then also making sure that we're continuing to invest in climate resilience, particularly around wildfire. We are going into likely another wildfire season, which will have profound impacts on the housing of the state, on affordability, on the population of the state. So these are key priorities. They continue to be key priorities through the budget. We all wish that we had more to work with, and that the January budget framework were more possible at this moment. But I think we've had to have really hard conversations with our staffs about the impacts on state employees from this budget. And one of the things that we've said, and Ann O'Leary, our chief of staff, has said, is we're lucky to work in a state where the governor is so focused on vulnerable populations and those who are most affected by this crisis, those making less than $15 an hour, those who are struggling to find affordable places to live, those who are out of work and will be out of work for the near future. That focus is a priority for all of us, because I think we all see, affordability, whether it's housing affordability or just, transportation affordability and accessibility of the state, is all related to each other. So we think of these things, and the governor thinks of these things as very related to each other. And we're just happy we're able to continue, focusing on those vulnerable populations. So that would be my main thing. I mean, I think it is really important to think about resilience at the same time we think about affordability, that an affordable housing solution is not a long-term sustainable housing solution unless it's also tied to accessibility of things like jobs and transportation, and tied to resilience. So we're not putting people in harm's way. And that's really where we come to these issues.
No, thank you very much. Kate, you were asking me if I miss being part of the administration looking at some of these issues, and working for government has been a highlight of my career so far. And I do not envy the number of hours and just all of the different decisions that you guys are grappling with. As you just said, we're talking about housing right now, but you also have to take into consideration kind of some of the fire situation that is kind of heading our way. And that is just one of the many other things that you're focusing on. And so thank you so much for doing all the work that you do. One of the things that we wanted kind of to touch upon, especially since we are talking about resiliency and sustainability, how do you see, and this is actually for you or Jason, what in your mind is the proper role of the state in determining land use? And should the state have more power to decide what happens in local jurisdictions under what circumstances? And again, the fire situation is a perfect one. So what are your thoughts on that, especially looking at from a land use lens?
A question with many layers. I guess what I'll say just at the outset, and then turn it to Jason. Most of my background, as folks probably know, is in the climate space, and particularly in the last few years, around climate risk and climate resilience. And it's hard to think about that issue using traditional municipal boundaries. It's just it's an inherently regional issue. If you look at the maps of the state and where our risks are, not just from fire, but extreme heat, sea level rise, flooding, water availability, ultimately those cross boundaries. If you do a sea level rise plan in one jurisdiction that involves a seawall, for instance, it would have effects on water levels in your surrounding jurisdictions. You can't make that decision in a vacuum. So I tend to think very regionally about decision making around those natural systems, and I think that's why we have a system that's set up to have watersheds and other regional governance structures. The challenge is that now that those issues are becoming more frequent and more severe, they're becoming more relevant to land use conversations, and our land use structures don't tend to be quite as inherently regional. There, we have a lot of other existing structures in place, and I think our challenge is to marry those two together in a way that is rational and doesn't add additional burden, to Jason's earlier point, doesn't add additional cost, and really makes it easy to do the right thing when it comes to development and when it comes to housing production and transportation provisions and all the other things we care about. So I don't know the right answer to that, but I will say that for sure the climate piece of it is regional by design and by definition. And I think that actually requires us to open our minds a little bit to thinking more regionally about all of these other decisions as well. So I'll let Jason jump in on this.
I think that was a good answer. What I'd add is another sort of flavor of the clear definition of housing and housing affordability is a matter of statewide concern that can coexist with local control. The governor was a mayor. Before he was a mayor, he was a supervisor. Before he was a supervisor, he was a commission member in San Francisco. So this is a person who understands local government and will always respect the role that local government plays. But there's housing is a matter of statewide concern, and I think that is the sort of the predicate for a number of the laws that have been passed and that we have had the opportunity and the luxury to exercise, including AB 72. But other initiatives that we have our eye on moving forward. Look, if coronavirus has taught us anything, it's that county lines, social problems don't stop at county lines. And what a decision that one county makes, be it to open or close businesses or to deny or approve housing, has material and measurable effects on what happens in adjacent and other counties around the state. So I think to everything Kate said in the sort of context of natural and working lands and wildfires and watersheds and so forth, I would just add affordability in there. And I know you mentioned it, but I would just add affordability in there as something that is just as much a system as a watershed is, and we have to think about it as such. And that, I think, is the predicate for a lot of the policy that we want to pursue.
And I think that's a great point. And just to add a little bit of a point on it, if you look at commute maps of the state, which we've done a lot, you also see that, of course, those are inherently regional. People don't confine themselves to their municipal and planning boundaries when it comes to where they live or where they can afford to live. And we have these sort of large constellations of commuting. We have 80,000 people a day go over the Altamont Pass, or we did, a day, for jobs in the Bay Area. So one of the things that we think about a lot from an affordability perspective is that housing affordability is as much about transportation affordability as it is about housing affordability. If you're in a more affordable house, but your transportation costs are 3 times what they were, you have to add those together and think about what's the bottom line, right, for affordability for a household. Also, we think about those commute sheds in terms of course, climate change, because the more folks are driving around the state, especially in areas without transit, the more that contributes to our transportation emissions. And so there is a need for this to be a really integrated approach of policy. And as Jason said, we're at the state level. It's our responsibility to make sure that, for instance, Bakersfield is the fastest growing city in California, and then the next fastest growing is Sacramento. We can't have a development pattern in the next 50 years that ignores the middle of the state. That's just not a rational thing to do. It's not an equitable thing to do. Come from with.
No, we really do appreciate the fact that the state is looking at a holistic approach. And when we talk about costs, we're not just talking about housing, but really taking into consideration the fact that transportation has to be part of that equation. When a family is looking at their costs, they don't just look at housing. They have to look at an entire budget, which a lot of the times includes transportation costs, whether it be car maintenance, gas, time spent. And so it really does have an impact on the quality of life, the quality of life that Californians can live. Well, saying that then, my other question that I had for you, are there any state level zoning reforms that you are contemplating to help with the housing production? And what are some of the thoughts that you have around that? Again, trying to understand some of the balancing that the government is going to have to do in terms of local control and looking at housing as a more regional approach.
Sure, I'll take this one. What some of the zoning reforms that we're contemplating, we're in conversation with the Pro Tem's office about what we think an interesting approach on that would be. I don't know where they're going to land, so I don't want to get too far ahead of that conversation. But I think that certainly just to get back to the point that needs to be made, it's not just about how much gets zoned. It's also about what process improvements we can make to ensure that when it does get zoned and when permits do get pulled, that it can be built. So the zoning reforms, if you want to think about it that way, you can sort of put them into two buckets. Number one is what kind of densification can happen in low density neighborhoods like single family neighborhoods, and seeing how much additional density can be accommodated in those places through creative things like ADUs, junior ADUs, and duplexes and things like that. So thinking along those lines, and then also continuing to push for more transit-oriented infill density. It's for so many reasons that have to do with affordability and climate. We can't do either or. It has to be a both approach, and really thinking about both how we spread density in a way that is climate appropriate, but also concentrate a lot of housing in areas where car trips are near zero, and make sure that the housing that's concentrated in those commercial corridors and downtown areas is affordable. So sort of statewide zoning. And then I think another thing that we're looking at is using excess state land and potentially partnering with local jurisdictions on their surplus land to try to pilot some creative and more aggressive programs around density and construction methods and natural affordability. So using this thing that we have, which is state land, several hundred parcels that we think are really well suited for residential development based on where they are and the grade and the size and the transit access and so forth, and trying to be really aggressive with what we own. Right, we're our own CEQA certifier at the end of the day. So being thoughtful about our portfolio, demonstrating what kinds of interesting things can get done on land that we own and potentially land that's owned by local jurisdictions, and not just cities and counties, but also thinking about school districts and special districts, including transit districts, and what kinds of interesting things can be done on that land. We're never going to get to the numbers we need based on excess state land. We know that. We're realistic about that, but it does also provide a demonstration of what can be done if one is willing to be creative and aggressive.
Thank you. Well, and kind of following along that train of thought, when you're looking at a lot of state land or publicly owned land, a lot of the land use itself might not be for housing. And so there's going to have to be a conversation both at the state and at the local level about how we can actually make those changes, which then lead to some of the CEQA discussions that are happening. Depending on who you ask, sometimes people will say that CEQA is used as a tool to prevent housing, and sometimes it actually is not doing that. It's actually trying to ensure that we are taking into consideration the footprint that housing or development can have. Do you think that the CEQA is going to be part of the conversation this year, given where we are in the time frame and everything else?
I hope so. I think it's a fool's errand to predict what will happen around CEQA reform in the legislature. And Graciela, you know that better than I do, having been doing this for so long. But I think we're hopeful and we're optimistic. And CEQA reform can take a few different forms, right? And one of them, and I know we're talking about housing, but let's talk about homelessness for a second, right? One of the things we really want to see is an enhanced local ability to build permanent supportive housing for people experiencing homelessness. And that's not just because of COVID, although again, COVID makes it more acute, but look, we're resourcing local governments to the tune of a couple $2 billion in coronavirus relief money to be able to implement some of these hotel motel conversions and other permanent supportive housing applications. We want to make sure that money can get deployed quickly and effectively. That might require some streamlinings. The governor was pretty open about it. He called for it directly, again, going back to the state of the state, saying we should extend some of the CEQA streamlinings that happened down in LA and make those statewide. So certainly that's part of where we're heading on the homelessness front. And on the housing side, look, I mean, I think it's all about the art of what's possible. And I'm not a legislative expert by any stretch, so I'll sort of just say we can be optimistic without getting into maybe more of the details there, because prediction is a dangerous game in that space. But I think we're hopeful, and we're working with everybody on that one, including the building trades and developer groups and affordable housing advocates and everyone who has an important voice in that conversation.
The only thing I'll add is just at a higher level on CEQA, we obviously at OPR, we do the guidance for CEQA, and so we spend a lot of time thinking about it. I think one of the challenges about it is that it was a process designed for a different thing than a lot of what we've ended up talking about. It really is designed for specific environmental impacts of projects, and has become many other things because it's such a kind of a big piece of the housing development process. And there's a lot, as you said, there's a lot of controversy. I mean, when I started this job, I was not a CEQA person. I am a lawyer, but I'm not a CEQA lawyer. And I came in, after a CEQA lawyer, Ken Alex. And so I felt I was coming in from behind a little bit. And I did a lot of reading and a lot of work on CEQA. And I will tell you that 99% of the studies that have been done on CEQA show that it is not the single biggest barrier to development in the state. On the other hand, it is obviously a really important piece of the puzzle. I think our goal, Jason's and mine, and the administration's goal is to really, as he said at the beginning, how do we actually solve these problems? How do we actually promote good development in the right places that's smart and that is moving the state in a good direction? How do we as a state help with that? And I think we're trying really hard to look at a huge range of things. We don't think that the entire conversation should be about CEQA, but it's certainly a piece of the puzzle. So I guess I would just say it's important to be creative and think beyond it as well. But obviously, as Jason said, we're not leaving it out.
Thank you. And there are obviously always things that are within the state's control and other things that are completely outside of that. COVID, for example, is a perfect example of those things, or even just the fact that our economy is in a very different place than it was in January. So one of the things that I'm just curious about is when we had the Great Recession a few years ago, we also had a big impact in our labor, and a lot of people that actually were doing construction moved out of the state. Do you think that's something that we should worry about during this recession? And what are some of the things that the governor is thinking about doing to help?
It's a great question, and I think the answer is unequivocally yes. That is something we should be concerned about, and it's also a place where we think we can make progress, right? So traditionally defined housing policy orthodoxy is the 3 Ps. We all know it, we all preach it, we all believe it. We think there should be a 4th P added to that, which is people. And the question, especially in a time where we're heading into unemployment numbers north of 20%, we know that if we don't have an equitable recovery strategy, a sort of conscious, equitable strategy around workforce, that we're going to end up exacerbating a lot of the problems that we saw 10 years ago when the Great Recession was here. So adding a 4th P to this sort of construct that we all know and love of the 3 Ps, I think is really important in this moment when, look, we get a report every morning of the cases, the coronavirus cases in California, and there's a little bar chart that shows by demographic, by ethnicity, the California population, and then how many people are affected by COVID and how many have died from COVID-19. And we all know it, but we are reminded of it on a daily basis in the data. This disease is having a disproportionate impact on communities of color in California, in the United States, but in California. So what are we going to do to be thoughtful about that now coming out of this? We're in the recession now, but coming out of the recession and trying to claw our way out in a way that really puts equity on the front burner here. And I think that looking at the construction industry, it's a place where, especially if you work with the building trades and come up with alternative pipelines into apprenticeship and so forth, and different construction methodologies, there are huge opportunities in that space to bring a lot of people into work and to do so quickly, and to do so in a lot of cases with public money, and to really meaningfully invest in that fourth piece. So we're protecting, we're preserving, we're producing, and we're also focusing on the people. So I think it's more than just sort of a quick yes to your question. It's a yes, and here's what we intend to do about it. The A page is the summary of the governor's budget that was put out yesterday, includes a little bit of content on this. I think we want to work with this group and we want to work with other housing leaders in the state to really think extra deeply about what it means to create an emphasis on people as well as we climb out of this recession.
I think just adding on what Jason said briefly, one of the things California has actually been good at over the years, and some of this was, of course, in the Brown administration, is thinking about, at the beginning when thinking about policy, thinking about these exact questions of equity that Jason brought up, and particularly around construction. One of the things that we've spent a lot of time looking at on the climate side, but it's very relevant to this conversation, is how do you attach apprenticeship programs, job training to areas where you see a lot of job growth. On the climate programs that we've done in the state, about 60% of the jobs created in those programs across the years that we've had the Cap and Trade Fund have been in construction. And so that's been something we've thought about a lot, is sort of how do you broaden the construction industry? How do you think about better pathways into it? How do you think about using policy to create those pathways? And there's some really great examples of things that have been done. One of them is a program that Governor Newsom has continued supporting, called the High Road Construction Career Ladders Program. And what that program does is it essentially attaches on to other policies, and it creates apprenticeships with a focus on pathways into those apprenticeships for folks for veterans, for women, for people from disadvantaged communities, for formerly incarcerated folks, and says, we're creating a pathway into construction, but into a multi-craft construction program, so that even if the thing you're working on, the solar installation program is the classic example, even if that dries up in the region that you live, you're now trained to do a variety of other things in the construction industry. That's proved to be incredibly beneficial and valuable to the folks who've gone through it, because it means that they're not sitting on the bench after their project is done. There's a lot more opportunity. And I think that we see, at least we hope we'll see, with potential federal stimulus dollars, and particularly to infrastructure, a lot of opportunity for construction jobs in the state, and a lot of opportunity to really broaden out that field and diversify the field and make it more accessible. And I think California is actually kind of on the leading edge of how to do that.
Great. Well, thank you. And especially, it's always important to figure out ways of creating and keeping more jobs in California. I think it just beneficial for everybody around. One of the questions that we had, moving on some of the RHNA conversations that are happening right now, there's current RHNA process, which is the regional housing need assessment, and then every region in the states figure out how many new units in order to accommodate the population growth. And there's been a lot of changes in the last couple of years. So how do you envision the rest of the RHNA process playing it out? And how do you think the new targets will impact housing production over the next cycle?
Maybe I'll start with this one, Kate, if it's okay with you. We were watching really closely what happened with the Southern California area governments. It was, I guess, maybe just before the new year, perhaps, when SCAG proposed some numbers that we didn't think were appropriate for the growth that's needed in that region, and then beyond that, were allocated in a way that we thought would exacerbate some of the climate and equity impacts of sprawl housing. And so we engaged pretty, I would say, pretty forcefully in that conversation, and SCAG ended up, I think, in a good place. We're making sure that we don't backslide on that now. But we insisted through HCD on a formula that we thought was based on data and based on sort of legally defensible read of the statute. I say that as a proof point for what RHNA means to us. And it's a gating factor. It is by no means the thing that is going to dig us out of the affordability crisis. But if you can't even get that done, if you can't even get the associated housing elements of general plans done according to a RHNA that sort of makes sense at a common sense level, then you're going to have trouble accomplishing anything else. So, I think, again, just sort of pointing to what I say the governor is all about, but more importantly, pointing to something that we did do as an administration, which in this case was standing up for a methodology in Southern California that we that we thought was right. I just as another point, I'll point to SACOG, which is the Sacramento area that by and large met its target and its obligation to plan for an appropriate amount of housing and in places that we thought made a lot of sense for that housing to go. And we were happy to work with SACOG on that and some thoughtful approaches they had on where to accommodate growth, because there are a lot of areas in Sacramento, as those of you who live up here know, that don't feel dense like LA. So being nimble enough to acknowledge that different parts of the state feel different. But for us, RENA, and certainly this goes to the Huntington Beach lawsuit that we filed early in our term, it's a symbol of something bigger, which is the numbers themselves matter, but it's also a symbol of a community's willingness to accept their share of this collective responsibility, this matter of statewide concern, which is housing. So, we had talked about a RENA redo in the budget last year, and we had started to put some good thinking to that. Just to be completely honest with you, we haven't revisited that thinking since coronavirus. I think that's something that we ought to do. There's just so much that we were excited about that was put on pause when this is my first day back in the Capitol. We've been over at the State Operations Center until yesterday. So it's really now turning our attention back to a lot of the policy questions that vexed us before coronavirus, when I'll just be completely honest with you, a lot of our time was sucked up in the emergency response and trying to get Project Roomkey stood up and trying to work with local governments who didn't have any staff going into work, but yet needed to fulfill their obligations under various housing laws. So it's been a lot of response, and I think we're trying very actively and consciously to move back into a policymaking mode. And being at the Capitol, I think, helps, but we're going to really start trying to think through those questions in greater detail. And then, within RENA, again, I'll just put the thought back out. Having it zoned is important. And how do we, as a state, think about the certainty that comes with that sites inventory? So it's good to have a sites inventory that sort of legally meets the mark. And then the question I would ask after that is, well, what's the realistic probability that certain number of units at certain levels of affordability get built? And let's think a little bit more deeply about that. And let's be a little bit more critical thinking on that. So I think that's another direction we want to head.
Yeah, I will only add a little. We're one of the folks at OPR who are tasked under last year's budget with thinking through the RENA reform. So we're just we're waiting to get direction from Jason on starting up those conversations, and eager to do that. I will say, just to underscore Jason's point about this really being a partnership with local government, SACOG, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, also just passed a set of reforms that will dramatically streamline housing production in a number of parts of that area, and include making some of it by right. And I think it's really worth looking at, because they've done a very thoughtful process on RENA, on their regional plan, on their sustainability strategy, and now have actually sort of taken the step of saying, look, as long we've got all of these frameworks in place, we've got all of these criteria in place, let's make sure we actually do what we said we're going to do. And it's very gratifying to see that.
No, it definitely is always a partnership with local governments. And at the end of the day, it also, it really matters how the resources that they have, not just money, but the number of people. And especially, again, a lot of the planning departments at the local level were decimated under the Great Recession. And so it's unfortunate that we're headed into another type of situation like that, which actually has everybody talking about additional funding for housing. And one of the conversations, obviously, as you guys are familiar with, is the split roll tax and what that might mean if it gets on the ballot and passes. Any thoughts on how, if that were to pass, how it would have, or the type of impact that it would have on California housing?
Yeah, I'm sitting in a government building, so I feel a little bit uncomfortable doing the sort of political analysis question, and so I'll sort of say that when it comes to investment in housing, when it comes to investment in any category of policy where we want to move forward, I think it's really important that we think about the trigger cuts that the governor talked about yesterday. So what I mean by that is you have core services in the state, social supports like Medi-Cal and CalWORKs, things that low-income people depend on literally as life and death questions, that are potentially facing reductions. So, I think it's important as we talk about any revenue raiser, and I'm going to sort of sidestep the political question a little bit because it's on the ballot and I'm here in the Capitol. But I would just sort of say that the fiscal picture is dire. And while we were able to maintain some of the key spending on housing, including the $500 million in housing tax, state housing tax credits, I just want to remind people of the situation that we're in, which is we are spending down the entirety of our reserves in the next 3 years, and we're making cuts to the general fund to the tune of 20-something%. Every state employee is taking a 10% pay cut. That's just personal to us, so I mention it. It's not anywhere near the most devastating cut. And even given all those things, we're facing a structural deficit in the out years of to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. So I think it's really important as we think about revenue, and we prioritize what we want to do with that revenue, because it's going to be pretty dire here for a long time unless this recession is much more V-shaped than people are predicting. We're going to be in a situation where there are going to be deep and dramatic cuts to social services that we all care very much about. And I'll just say last point on this. I worked for Mayor Newsom during the Great Recession, when we were facing a 32% general fund deficit. We're at a 37% general fund deficit now. But he had to face down those hard choices around HIV/AIDS programs versus homeless shelters versus feeding programs. And that's just not why any of us come to public service, to decide whether or not to cut that healthcare program or that social service. But those are the decisions that we're facing, and it's a pretty bleak outlook. And I don't want to sort of be over dramatic about this, but it's a pretty bleak outlook. And so just to keep that in mind in the context of what we talk about in terms of revenue and revenue raisers.
I'm going to leave it at that.
No, I completely agree. And I think if you follow budget, especially the California budget, I think it's safe to say it actually took us about a decade before we could fully restore some of the social cuts that happened 10 years ago, right? And so it just underscores kind of the situation that we are in and the reality that we're heading into. But thankfully, we have a strong leader in California. I can't say that for the federal government, but at least we have a very strong leader in California. And
here's the other thing. The Brown administration left us with the structure for various budget stabilizations and rainy day reserves, that if we didn't have those, and we didn't have those to draw down on, and the new education reserve and the social safety net cuts reserve, if we didn't have those, my God, I don't know the position we would be in right now. I mean, the fact that we're able to draw down the tens of billions of dollars in those various reserves and spread it over the next 3 years is it's a lifesaver. Actually, literally, it's just a lifesaver. So that's with appreciation to the Brown administration too for leaving us with that legacy, because we didn't do that on our own.
Thank you. One of the other questions that we have is, everybody would like to know. So do you think of any, given that it is an election year, in terms of any potential ideas that the governor or the legislature might want to put on the ballot this November? If you had a crystal ball, any predictions?
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question? I got distracted. I'm sorry.
Not a problem. Given that it's an election year, if you had a crystal ball, anything that the legislature or the governor might like to put on the ballot to help housing or
I would like to put to the voters a vaccine for coronavirus. That's what I would like to put to the voters, and if they approve it, then we will have a vaccine for coronavirus. No, I mean, I think it's look, there's obviously the legislature is considering a couple of different bonds, and some of those were proposed before the pandemic, and I think need to be assessed and reflected on in light of the situation we're facing now. But I was sort of joking, but not joking, which is, we're going to make it, we flatten the curve now in California. We're going to make it through this, looks like this spring and early summer without the surge in the hospitals that we had feared. But, you talk about the fall, and where my mind goes is that we're anticipating another increase in positive cases, and potentially something more significant than what we've experienced now. And so what will that mean, and where will the electorate be, and what will the appetite be if we're now back in a, some sort, and please don't take this as a prediction of what will happen, but it has to be on people's minds. What if we're back in a more restrictive stay-at-home setting, come October again, right? This is not over. And I think we have to be thoughtful as leaders and as advocates to try to look in that crystal ball and understand that, we might be living with coronavirus, C19, C20, C21, and so on and so forth for a lot longer than any of us want. And so what does that mean for the agenda that we're setting on budget, on ballot, on housing, on any of these questions?
Thank you so much. Now, I think I'm going to open it up to questions from the public. And so bear with me.
Sure.
I'm looking at my iPad and trying to figure the next question. And actually, while we wait for those to filter in, while we wait for the questions to filter in, I will ask you another one, since I have you
Sure.
guys now. So one of the questions, I think, when Governor Newsom first came in, he was very excited about actually creating a cabinet position that would focus just on housing. What are your thoughts about that? And again, granted, things have completely changed from when conversations were happening, but is that something that you guys are still looking into? Is that maybe postponed for now?
Yeah, so I can tell you, so I first want to acknowledge we just hired a new secretary of the Business Consumer Services and Housing Agency. Her name is Lourdes Castro Ramirez. We also just very recently appointed a new director of the Department of Housing and Community Development, Gustavo Velasquez. So we have a leadership team in place now, in addition to Kate and Louise at SGC and a number of other the housing functions around the state. We feel very confident in the team that the governor has assembled to do housing and land use. So that said, the state has a disjointed housing approval and funding sort of mechanism, and it includes other constitutional officers, and it includes a couple of different departments spread across other agencies. It is just plainly stated not the most efficient way to administer housing policy and funding. So in January, we had proposed thinking about a potential consolidation of various housing functions and housing agencies. It's, to be honest with you, back in that same category of things we have not yet revisited. And, you know, we lost 2 or 3 months of not focusing on that as much as it probably deserved. So where we're at this point is looking at different consolidations that we can do, not so much in terms of the structure of government, which in state government, as you know, Graciela, requires a pretty rigorous and formal process to reorganize government. But there are things that you can't just sort of do it and say, we think this department should be over there and have it be done. There's a rigorous and sometimes multi-year process to get that done, which is stipulated in the Constitution and statute. But what we can do are do things like institute a common application at HCD and try to think a little more and be a little more thoughtful with our partners in the controller's office and the treasurer's office that sit on the various alphabet soup boards, TCAC, CIDLAC, and CalHFA, about how we can be more user-friendly to the affordable development community and to people who are trying to access those various forms of subsidy. So there are things we can do that don't require a full GRP, but we're going to do those things in parallel as we think about the broader question, which is, should housing and homelessness be its own thing? I think it's an open question, right? You spend a lot of time on a reorg, and the question is, at the end of the day, what are you hoping to accomplish with that reorg? And there are some really, really smart and positive things that can happen that way. And then a simultaneous question you ask is, what can you get done towards that goal without doing the full little Hoover GRP process, right? So, and can we accomplish a lot of the same things we want to do? So I think it's an open question, and I don't mean to sort of lead the conversation to one conclusion or another, but I think it's something that we have to be thoughtful and open about.
Yeah, and I mean, the reality of government, just like everything else, is that it's about people and individuals as much as it is about anything. And Lourdes Castro Ramirez is a housing force of nature. And I haven't gotten to meet Gustavo yet, but I'm very excited about him. We now have a secretary who is very focused on these issues. And I think that it will make a huge difference in terms of bringing them up to the fore, especially at this moment of crisis. I will also say, as the chair of the Strategic Growth Council, that that's a really useful forum in which we have the heads of the cabinet level heads of transportation, housing, also agriculture, also health, all together, you know, making decisions, and resources in EPA, of course, too, but making decisions about exactly what Jason talked about, which is sort of how do we do a better job ourselves of doing more aligned processes across our agencies, so people aren't dealing with 17 different grant timelines for related projects that have multiple elements over different agencies. How can we, you know, think creatively about, and we've been talking about even, you know, regional applications for multi-agency projects, so people can do one comprehensive application, and we're the ones doing the work to figure out which piece of it falls where. We're not putting that on other people. I think we can do a lot. and the governor January budget had a lot of really good language on this. We can just do a lot on streamlining in our own processes, and I think, frankly, we'll be forced to because of the crisis, the budget crisis. But we also should.
Well, thank you. Now I have a couple of questions from the audience. So this question comes from David. The revised budget described that the general fund will not be able to provide low interest loans and loan guarantees for the 700 climate projects, and that the administration remains committed to leveraging private capital to support a climate catalyst fund. Can you please provide some color as to how and where you see these private capital coming to play to address the important intersection of growth, housing, and climate action?
Yeah, I'll take this one. The Climate Catalyst Fund, for those who were not deeply enmeshed in the January budget, was a proposal floated to do ultimately $1 billion fund, but starting with 250 million in the first year, to use government capital to essentially de-risk projects in the climate space, projects that are fully, part of our overall climate goals in a variety of areas, but that are ripe for private investment because they're basically commercial, but aren't getting invested in for a variety of reasons. They're seen as risky because of potentially the small business owners who want to put them forward, or the regions that they're in, which are under capitalized, or they're seen as risky technologies by mainstream lenders, even though they're very well known in the climate space. So the Climate Catalyst Fund was an idea that the governor was very supportive of and continues to be supportive of. We can't put general fund into it at this moment, but he's really kind of tasked us, and that by us in this case, I really mean the whole set of people working on climate, but particularly my office and the GoBiz and the iBank, the infrastructure bank, which is where this would be living, to figure out alternative capitalization methods for it. And we're looking at the private sector. We're also, frankly, looking at federal potential for federal dollars for that. And there is a federal conversation going on about the potential for an infrastructure bank type of structure that states would be able to use. I think what's exciting about it from the perspective of this conversation is what we're trying to do is inherently flexible enough to have a broad definition of what a climate project is. If you look at some of the green banks that other states like Connecticut and New York have put forward, they're very narrow. They're really effective, but they're very narrow in scope. So Connecticut's Green Bank was designed to just look at renewable energy projects. 10 years ago, when that happened, it was a great moment to do that. There wasn't a lot of private money going into those projects. They were seen as risky. Today, most of those projects are, they outperform fossil fuel projects, and they're not risky at all in the private sector. And so it's not necessarily the best place for government to be putting money to de-risk a project. So we are really looking at something that's more flexible and allows for investment in things that are now top of mind. For instance, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, particularly in places where individual homeowners aren't the ones putting it in, where you have multifamily housing, for instance, or you need public infrastructure charging. Those are both housing issues, transportation issues, and climate issues. There's a potential for infrastructure projects, transit-oriented development, for instance, that would be an interesting place to look. We're looking at economic development in places like the North State, where we're taking a lot of wood out of the forest right now, and we don't really know what to do with it. There's not a clear infrastructure for turning that into a higher value product, and there's a lot of need for jobs and a lot of need for economic activity up there. So we're really thinking through kind of how do you design something that's flexible enough to be responsive to the actual needs of a state, fully consistent with our climate goals and our just overall development goals, and capitalized through a variety of sources. So that's the conversation we're having internally. As it said in the budget language, we've already, in the process of this fund, thinking through the fund, after January, we've identified over 700 potential pipeline projects already that really span transportation, forestry and ag, waste to value, recycling and sort of waste to value projects. So lots and lots and lots of opportunities. And the question is really sort of how do we kind of jumpstart that? And we're excited about figuring it out. And a lot of people are thinking about it creatively. So any ideas anyone has, please get in touch, because we're very interested in moving that forward.
Thank you, Kate. Okay, our next question comes from Brittany. And what can local governments start to do in anticipation of the governor's homelessness and housing efforts to be supportive and help pivot in response?
Thanks. That's a great question. I think the first thing that local governments can do is if they have a Project Roomkey hotel in their jurisdiction, to start thinking about what their opportunity is to acquire that hotel. So I mentioned Project Roomkey before. It's basically the state's effort, state-led, county-implemented effort to lease up as many hotels and motels around the state as possible to provide non-congregate shelter opportunities for homeless individuals. For all of the obvious reasons, you don't want large groups of people, particularly those with underlying medical conditions, in a tight confined space, sleeping a few feet from each other in the middle of coronavirus. So the response to that is Project Roomkey, which is a full wraparound service model using private hotels and motels through operating agreements, not commandeered, to provide those shelter opportunities. We're at about 15,600 rooms statewide over, I want to say 51 or 52 counties across the state. So the answer to the question is take a look at what Project Roomkey hotels are already in the portfolio in that jurisdiction and think about how you would structure the financial stack to buy that hotel, acquire it, and then to rehab it. Because in a lot of these cases, you're going to need to do ADA. You're going to need to put in kitchens or other kinds of facilities to make it a housing unit as opposed to a hotel unit. And not in all cases, but in a lot of cases. The governor is very much focused on this as a strategy coming out of the pandemic, or at least this wave of the pandemic. We have all of these folks, thousands and thousands and thousands of people who, for a lot of them, this is their first time since they've become homeless, finally getting inside. We finally gotten these folks inside. We, at a minimum, want to make sure that we don't lose these individuals back to the streets, back to the encampments, and back to the shelters. So the first thing I would say is take a look at what has already been done by the county with the state partnership and see about acquiring those hotels. If, for whatever reason, you've been able to figure out a stack and you can use some of our money for that purpose and the coronavirus relief funding that we have redirected, or we are proposing to redirect to the local governments. So there's money out there. See if you can buy those Roomkey hotels. Then take a look at what other opportunities there are for assets that in this market may be ripe for the purchase by a public entity or a nonprofit. Look, we all lived through the distressed real estate crisis of the Great Recession, where we watched buildings and neighborhoods get decimated by gentrification pressure from buildings being bought and sold. And we want to make sure that we don't repeat those mistakes. And so to the greatest extent possible, communities can also focus on those places that are acutely at risk of gentrification and pressure, because if people don't have a place to go and their building is distressed and rent collections are down and it's foreclosed, we're creating homelessness as we're trying to solve it on the other end. So I think what I would say is start with Roomkey, see if you can structure a financial transaction to bring those projects into public ownership. Look at other buildings that are available in a same sort of distressed economic way. See if those can be brought into the public portfolio for permanent or affordable housing for the homeless. And then think more broadly about how coronavirus relief fund money, of which there is, I want to say tens of billions. I might be exaggerating a little bit, but there are many billions of dollars available to California jurisdictions for these kinds of acquisitions, and we would say that's a good place to focus.
Well, thank you. That's a lot of good advice. One other question. This one is from Jim. If you had to create a pandemic playbook using all of the elements being discussed while they're still fresh in your mind, what are some of the lessons you would say government has learned?
In the housing space or more broadly?
I think a little housing space or broadly?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing we did, and I remember we all got called to the State Operations Center on a Sunday, was we sat in a room and we wrote down on a whiteboard vulnerable populations, right? And so that includes the homeless, but it's not limited to the homeless. And we said, okay, this is our first responsibility, because in a lot of cases, these are people who are our wards. whether they're prisoners in the CDCR system or whether they're in some other congregate facility that we're running via the state hospital or the foster system. These are people who are our responsibility legally and morally, right? So the first thing we had to do was say, who are the vulnerable populations around the state? And let's start making contingency plans towards protecting them. That's what really, that was the sort of origin story of Project Roomkey, which I was involved in. And so I can just say, in terms of a pandemic playbook, the first thing you got to do is think about the most vulnerable, because if you lose a day or a week there, and that includes vulnerable renters, by the way, if you lose a day or a week there, you may never recover. And, you know, a couple of other places around the country have seen some pretty dramatic impacts of coronavirus on homeless populations, and knock on wood. And this is, I mean, talk about what I lose sleep over. You know, we saw a really bad infection spread at MSC South there in San Francisco. There was a particular rescue mission down in Skid Row that also experienced a very significant outbreak very quickly. And again, with whatever God or deity you pray to, those infections in other places where we've had these spreads have not led to significant numbers of fatalities, but they have led to significant numbers of hospitalizations. So I'll just sort of go back and say, the hospital in a pandemic, and now we're way outside the housing zone, but these are the kinds of conversations we're having. In a pandemic, your limiting asset in this pandemic, not in all pandemics, your limiting asset is your hospital capacity, your ICU capacity, and in this case, it's ventilators. So then you plan backwards from that. You want to make sure that you have as many ventilators, ICU beds, and staffed ICU beds as you possibly can, and then you start planning backwards. So how can we decompress the hospital system such that we keep that asset? That's the scarce asset. How do we keep that asset available to the greatest extent possible? And in places that struggled and didn't get going as quickly as California did, you saw that when they got overwhelmed, it's like once the water flows out of the cup, then it's just everywhere, right? And so we were really, really working 24 hours a day to avoid that particular thing. So coming back to the sort of narrow, when it comes to the homeless population, if a homeless individual or a group of homeless individuals test positive or are suspected for COVID, so let's just say there's a 10-person encampment, they're all coughing, they all have symptoms, they go into the hospital, every single one of them is positive. Where exactly are they supposed to go, right? They can be discharged back to an encampment to self-isolate in an encampment. I mean, that's a bad idea for a whole host of reasons. We can refer those individuals back to a congregate shelter setting where they will encounter other people. Again, profoundly bad idea. Or we can keep them in the hospital, which is really the only humane thing to do, but then that impacts that scarce asset. So we needed to create a fourth option, and the fourth option was the hotel program, right? And that's sort of how we got, the question is very broad, and I'm giving a sort of narrow example, but that's how the hotel program was born, was to say homeless individuals, if they test positive, or if they're severely at risk of complications, so someone who has serious comorbidities, who's over 65 years old, whatever it might be, underlying health conditions, we need to find a place for these folks so that we can keep them safe because their humanity demands it and compassion demands it. But it's also going to materially impact our ability to surge and slack our hospital system, which impacts all of us, people who are housed, right? Which is, if I get sick and the hospital system is full, I don't get priority, nor should I, over a homeless individual because I happen to be housed. That's just not the way that healthcare works. And so, you know, if I get sick, God forbid, I go back to my house and I self-isolate at my house. But obviously homeless individuals don't have that option. So we needed to create that option. And that was sort of how Project Roomkey was born. I can point to a number of other examples where things were born of necessity, that kind of after someone comes up with an idea, you go, yeah, that makes sense. Great Plates Delivered is another example, which has nothing to do with homelessness at all. This is a program where we said, okay, restaurants are down 90%, and you have seniors who are literally going hungry. I mean, there was a woman, an elderly woman in San Diego, called our constituent affairs office and said, I can't get a hold of anybody and I haven't eaten in 2 days. Can you help me find food? Right. That was the story that pushed us to think about this stuff in a different way. And out of that, Great Plates Delivered was born, which is a way of connecting restaurants. So I didn't actually explain what it is. It's restaurants, private restaurants, your favorite neighborhood cafe, if they enroll, is able to deliver, not through a social service program, but like through an Uber Eats type situation, deliver 3 meals a day, nutritious meals a day to homebound seniors with certain income qualifications. So you're solving 2 problems there at once, right? Which is this pandemic is exacerbating a hunger epidemic, and we've got restaurants that are dying for business. That's probably a bad turn or phrase, but are desperate for business and are laying off workers, which is exacerbating our economic condition. Well, let's just try to solve two of those things at the same time. So there, I can go through a number of other examples there, but I would say in the pandemic playbook, and I think the economic recovery playbook is a different question, and we've impaneled a task force to help us think through that. And I won't be so presumptuous as to suggest I know where that's headed. But in terms of the pandemic playbook and the immediate response, it's think about the vulnerable populations first, especially those who are our responsibility, literally, because we're their last line of defense, and so we need to make sure that we step up for those communities, and then do so in a way that prioritizes your scarce assets. In the case of coronavirus and COVID-19, it's ventilators and ICUs, and then plan backwards from there.
Great. And Kate, for you, the question is probably has a little bit of a different impact just because of the type of work that you do within OPR. Any type of feedback that you would give given the type of work that OPR tends to do with a lot of like local governments?
Yeah, it's a complicated question and a good one because there's a lot of different ways to answer it. The thing that strikes me in general, and also from what Jason just said, is we're really spending a lot of time thinking about what kind of things we're learning through the pandemic response process and what's played out there that are actually applicable long term. So, I think it's an important point that the Project Room Key isn't designed to solve the entire state's homelessness problem. It's as Jason laid out, it's a very specific response to a specific set of people, but it's a really important set of learnings through doing that program that we're, I'm sure, thinking through for longer term responses. I think that's also true. One of the areas that I know the planners on the line are thinking about a lot, and we're certainly thinking about it a lot, is just the telework situation. I mean, this is a massive behavior change in a very short period of time. So many people for many years have known that something called Zoom, for instance, existed. People were occasionally FaceTimed their grandparents. It was like a very small, specific set of things. I used to do a lot of work with China, and we do video conferences, right, with China sometimes. But the transition to the wholesale use of video technology for meetings that people used to say could not be done remotely, or work that people used to say could not be done remotely and is now being done remotely, I don't think we go back from that 100%. It's interesting. I've been spending a lot of time looking at the emission declines from the last recession, which all came right back up again. And those emission declines, there's a bunch of skeptics out there saying, well, that'll just happen again here. Yes, we're driving less and it's all just going to come right back to where it was, just like it did last time. And I would question that, because in the last recession, that was really a demand-driven recession. People stopped driving because they were out of work. That's certainly true now as well, but also a big set of people have stopped driving because they're working in a different way. I think some of those changes will persist. And we're doing a lot of thinking, and you'll actually see it in the May revision of the budget, a lot of thinking about how to incorporate some of those learnings and some of that behavior change into state operations. We're thinking really strategically about how do we institutionalize telework across more departments to allow people to have more time where they're not coming up to Sacramento. That would save us all kinds of things. It would save commuting costs. It would save potentially on just physical office space, because if you have a different way of working, then you can potentially have fewer offices. But it also, on the climate side, it advances our climate goals by reducing vehicle miles traveled. So we're looking at that really seriously. I know a lot of private companies are as well. And I think it's just very interesting. It's obviously not possible for everybody. There's a huge swath of the economy that cannot telework. We rely on these industries where in-person engagement is necessary to the industry. And that's unfortunately particularly true of folks who are in the lower income brackets across California. But for those who can, I think it's quite interesting to think about how do we sort of learn from this, and what impacts does it ultimately have on how we plan, how we design where we live, what is affordability and not affordability, how does it reduce transportation costs, how does it allow for more choices. I think Spur has done a lot of great writing on this very subject. So I'll point people to Sarah Karlinski and her great work, but it's been a topic of conversation across the world for planners, and I think, we've never seen anything quite like this. And I think there will be significant changes. The piece that's maybe a little more glass half empty, although I think there's a lot of creative thought going into it, is the long-term impacts on transit. I also don't think that we bounce back to public transit looking like it did easily. And that's going to be a big question too. And how do cities think through, how many lines to run, where to run lines, whether to shift to on-demand van pools in some places away from the large buses, where to run more things. I mean, it's gonna be a moment which calls for a lot of innovation in transit, and I think we're ready for that moment. I mean, we're in a new era of transportation when it comes to technology anyway, and so this is kind of going to be the time to step up and come up with new ideas there. And we're actually really lucky; we have great leadership on transportation in the state as well. But I think it's not going to look the same. It's not going to be a bounce back to the same level for a lot of reasons, and some of them could be really interesting from a planning perspective.
I'll just add one anecdote to what Kate said. I was speaking with a woman a couple of days ago who has a company that does, the way it was described, it's Google Street View for construction sites. So you can visit your construction site. It's updated on a daily basis. And if you're a construction manager or a building inspector or whatever it might be, you can walk a construction site on a daily basis from the comfort of your office or your home. That is just one example of something, and they existed before COVID, but obviously their demand, like Zoom, we all knew it existed. We never really used it. There's a whole growth sector, and it's going to happen in California first, because it always does, where these kinds of things that we haven't even thought of are going to start becoming much more prevalent, and it's going to be a choice more than it is a necessity to stay home and to do more virtually. So we have great confidence in California to innovate and come up with these kinds of ideas, like virtually walking a construction site, and we just need more of that in more creative ways.
Definitely interesting to see how this historical event will change us as a society. One other question we have from Colleen. So we're hearing that this fire season could be really bad. That meant loss of housing for many in the last few years. What actions is the state taking to protect high-risk areas, even though our budget has been scaled back dramatically? And I think just adding to that, I think the other complication for us is normally one of the things we could actually rely on is shelters, right? Especially in affected areas. That's going to have to change how we actually address these things. So Jason, Kate, would love to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, this is a question that Kate can give a much more substantive answer to. I want to start with just a couple of quick things from the budget and from the OES perspective. So one of the things that we talk about every morning, we do a sort of government-wide call where we discuss the response to COVID. Kate's on that call as well. And one of the topics that's always discussed with some good frequency is how are we prepared to respond to whatever the other emergency may be. And, there was an earthquake this morning, if folks didn't catch that over on the border. Luckily there were no significant impacts, but hey, if that's on the San Andreas or the Hayward, we're in a very different situation. And, no one can predict when earthquakes can come, but you can predict that there is going to be a fire season. In fact, we are already in fire season. We're up by orders of magnitude in terms of the number of fires. And one of the things that Chief Tom Porter, who runs CAL FIRE, has really been focused on is there's an interesting conversation around suppression versus prevention and all those kinds of things. But in this moment, we need to make sure that if a fire happens, you are going to have to move a lot of people out of a neighborhood and into high school gymnasiums. And for all the reasons that are obvious, that's not a good plan. So we're really making sure that we're focused very strongly on keeping fires from becoming really big while we're still working on COVID. And while the budget has been reduced writ large, the governor did announce a number of actually enhancements and additional equipment that he's bringing into the state portfolio for firefighting through CAL FIRE because of these very issues, right? And by the way, you're also asking firefighters to live in congregate settings and be in very close quarters with each other as well, and that's obviously not indicated for the pandemic. So that's sort of the more tactical answer, but I think the question is probably more interesting from the sort of policy angle. So maybe I'll defer to Kate on that one.
No, those are great points, and it is hard. I mean, it's something we think about a lot at OPR. We run the integrated climate adaptation and resilience program at OPR, and are very focused on working with state and local governments on climate resilience in general. And as Jason said, most of these climate impacts are fairly predictable, not just fire, but also extreme heat, which we've already seen affect the state in a couple places this year. The whole world of water availability and water quality and drought and flood is a big one. Obviously, sea level rise a little bit more long-term and chronic, but still really important, particularly to planners. And we're dealing with, again, sort of thinking about built environments that will be in place for a very long time. Some of them, and Jason was mostly pointing to, are existing structures, which are many of them at risk. And how do we harden those communities? How do we shore up those structures? How do we have plans in place that make sense given coronavirus? And I will say that again, this budget that we just proposed does continue prioritizing fire prevention as one of the key areas, again, through both the resources department or resources agency budget, but also through the greenhouse gas reduction fund, because fire is a major climate issue. It is a big emission releaser, as you all know. But we also are doing a lot of thinking at the state level, particularly with our own buildings, but also thinking about policies around just longer term resilience. One of the things we need to be thinking about as the state grows, and as we're doing things, as Jason's been talking about encouraging housing production, thinking through where to build, how to build, is just thinking about how to build more in a more resilient way, so that we're not putting people at risk, down the line for a set of events that we just predictably know will happen. One of the hard things about climate events is they're kind of baked into the system. So the climate events we're seeing today, the increased fires, the increased floods, the dry seasons, are climate driven to a great extent. And the emissions that created those are all from my, for instance, lifetime. The last 40 years of emissions have created this current situation. So it's not like we're doing a huge amount to bring down emissions, but what we're doing today to bring down emissions is not going to affect our current fire season. There it is. We got to prepare for it. We have to adapt to it. We have to be resilient in the face of it. So I just think, sort of maybe a call to action a little bit, anyone who's thinking about kind of investing in infrastructure or housing or anything that's kind of place-based and going to be around for a long time needs to be thinking about this. This state, is an amazing state and unbelievably beautiful and subject to a lot of climate events. So this is part of the way we live, and we need to be thinking about it and be integrating it into our thoughts, thinking much more than we have in the past. And that's something that we continue to do. And I will say that unlike a lot of places that I've worked, our Office of Emergency Services and our fire department are very focused on resilience, and we have a very robust conversation, not just about prevention and recovery in the short term, but really around long-term resilience. The CAL FIRE invests in climate modeling, for instance, to look at probabilistic modeling for the next couple of decades, and that's pretty unusual for a state emergency service. So I think we're really lucky that we've got that kind of thoughtfulness going into this question.
Well, thank you both. That's very, very good answers for us. And I think everybody on the call is excited about the work that Governor Newsom has done, how much he has prioritized housing and really dedicated a lot of time and put a lot of very smart people to kind of help figure this problem and find a solution for it. So thank you so much. One last question, because we have a lot of people that are excited about this opportunity. How can organizations like Housing Action Coalition, SPUR, and California YIMBY best support efforts across the state to build more housing in all income levels? And what makes you optimistic?
Kate, you want to start, or would you like me to?
I'll start. I'll give you the last word. How about that, Jason? I think I come to everything from sort of a background of thinking about climate as related to all these issues. And I think for me, one of the really important things is to bring more allies to the table around housing who are coming to it from the climate side. One of the things we talk about a lot is that housing is a climate issue. When I speak to local government folks, it's usually the first thing I say. They say, what can we do to, what can we do to be more active on climate in our city, our region? And I always say, go to your Board of Supervisors meetings when there's a housing project on the table, because I think it's really, really critical to see these things as related to each other. If we don't build more housing in this state, we will not have more affordable housing. And that will mean people will continue to be pushed out of the state, but also pushed further and further out. There's all kinds of climate implications of that. And it's just not a sustainable growth model in general. And so I would just say, continuing to make those connections, continuing to look at those intersections, and continuing to support us in trying to do the right thing at the state level, but also really push local governments, because this is, again, is a partnership and we're a piece of it, but we're not all of it. Jason?
Thanks. So I think at a very tactical level, I'm holding in front of me a couple of things that I know have come from California YIMBY, and I imagine others on this call have worked. There's a letter that we got here with a whole bunch of policy ideas, immediate measures needed to abate the COVID-19 crisis, and then a whole bunch of stuff around recovery. This is so helpful because you're putting things on our radar. You're providing us with indications of what matters to the community of people who believe in housing. This other thing I have here is this really awesome graphic, and it's like a little 4x5 that Alfred put together. And I love these little graphics that sometimes California YIMBY puts out. Now, I printed this one out, and I'm not going to show this one to the camera because I wrote my notes all over it, and I don't want you guys to see what I'm thinking about those bills. So I'm going to put that over there. But anyway, that kind of stuff is really helpful. And I think at a very high level, what Kate said is right. This is a battle and a fight that is going to get won or lost at the local level. In Sacramento, you have tremendous allies in the legislature. You have an ally in the administration. And what we now need is to recruit allies at the local level. And there are a lot of champions locally who are doing the right thing. And there are still cities and counties that are pushing back, and will continue to unless we keep fighting forward. So I think at a very high level, I second what Kate said about getting in the trenches here. And, when it's right to do so, file those lawsuits. When it's right to do so, put that local ballot measure on. When it's right to do so, fight for those council candidates that are going to be in favor of housing. And then at a tactical level, just keep getting this kind of analysis in front of us and in front of the legislature, because I think it's an important voice that wouldn't otherwise be represented here. And so I just say the letters and the infographics and the campaigns, I think it makes a big difference. And I'll just tell you, I've only been here a year and a half, so I'm a relative newcomer to Sacramento, but I can just tell you, I feel the difference that this stuff makes. And so it's working, and so just keep it up. And then what makes me, I want to answer the question about what makes me hopeful. What makes me hopeful is that, I'll sort of end where I started, was we spent a lot of time both during the campaign for governor, but then once we got into office, thinking about what we wanted to do to materially improve and increase housing production, and to get a whole bunch of homeless people moved off of the streets and into housing. And we spent a long time talking with a lot of folks that are on this call and working with us on our jobs task force, that this constellation of leaders, thought leaders, and advocates and policy experts. We spent a lot of time crafting an agenda for what we wanted to do on housing and homelessness. And then COVID happened, and we find ourselves at this moment now, 24 hours off of May Revise, kind of pursuing a lot of the same strategies. So what makes me hopeful is that we're not starting from scratch here, right? And I look across the proverbial hall at some of my colleagues who are leading the medical response to coronavirus. They're creating a new response, because we didn't know this was going to happen in February, right? I look at some of my colleagues who are leading on the jobs recovery side, the labor agency. They are dealing with an unemployment epidemic that no one could have envisioned several months ago. So, I think as we look to our other friends in advocacy in different policy fields or whatever, we have some sympathy for the fact that they're trying to build plans as they fly them. And that's really hard. And they're trying to create strategies. We don't have to do that, because we had the luxury, frankly, of implementing a lot of the similar solutions we thought were needed, because the affordability crisis and the homeless crisis existed before coronavirus. So I suppose that makes me hopeful, although that's a weird thing to say. But what it really means is that we're still solving towards the same crises. They're more acute, they're hitting communities more deeply. But a lot of the strategies that we've worked so hard and that many of us have bled to try to bring across the finish line are still what's called for. Right. And I think that gives me hope, because again, we're in the governor's office, and certainly at OPR as well, we're responsible for a portfolio of priorities that extends well beyond the built environment and homelessness. And, some of my colleagues here who are my friends are watching programs that they were so invested in not move forward, and that's really devastating. And we have the sort of luxury, if you want to call it that, of having this crisis that predated COVID. It's a weird thing to say, but it means that we have the running room to try to get some of this stuff done. So that makes me hopeful in a sort of weird and backwards way, but that's what makes me hopeful.
Well, thank you so much both for spending so much time with us and just kind of walking us through some of your thinking on this. And I want to turn it over to Todd. David, I got to tell you, this was a great way of ending my Friday. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be here with you today. Todd?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Graciela, Jason, and Kate, thank you so much for spending your Friday afternoon with us. It was so informative. Just a couple of final thoughts really on the last thing that both of you, Jason and Kate, said. Kate, it is a constant reminder to us who are advocates that we need to lead with the environmental argument. It's one of those things that we know all the time, but it's kind of like I feel like we too often go like, oh yeah, and that, as opposed to being like, no, actually that I think is the place where there's common ground, right? Of being like, housing policy is environmental policy, and the best thing we can do for the environment is, dense urban infill housing or great transit. And we have to lead with that. And Jason, the thing that we've been talking about all the time is that, the affordability and displacement crisis pre-existed COVID, but the COVID emergency has just brought all of the inequities that come along with that affordability and displacement crisis to the forefront. And I think that we believe that there are now true political opportunities that exist to solve those crises that maybe were more aspirational 100 days ago. And so those are the things that I know we as an organization are optimistic and excited about. Anyway, thank you. I want to thank again my our co-hosts, Spur and California Yimby. And I hope everyone has a great weekend and everyone stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you.
Thanks to the 78 of you who hung in to the very end. You're true believers. I appreciate it. See you later.